Okay, I'm bringing Dr. Nia in. Okay, everyone, we have a few more minutes and then we can start. It's always funny when you're doing a webinar or a meeting and you're watching the clock to make sure that you started exactly on time. And attendees that are in the room, Miss Saritha Long and Miss McFarlane, if you can hear me, can you just type in the chat if you're able to? Okay, good. Great, thank you. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Melanin Stratification, the impact of colorism on light-skinned members of society. I'm the moderator and your host. My name is Dr. Donna Maria Culbreth. And before we go into introducing our guests, I'll give you a brief overview of what this fireside chat is going to focus in on. As we are aware, colorism is an issue that continues to plague members of society. But one of the biggest issues that we've noted is that there's very limited discussions or literature focusing in on how people with light skin are impacted, affected, or the psychological, emotional, physical, and social issues they deal with when they are victimized by colorism acts. So as we go through the fireside chat, at the end of the session, you will be able to ask questions, which we will answer for you to the best of our ability. At any time during the session, I want to make sure everyone's aware the session will be recorded. So at the time you are able to ask questions, you will be visible on the screen. If you do not want to be visible on the screen because the session is recorded, at that time you can turn your cameras off. Okay, so let's begin. I'll start by first going over again the description of the fireside chat, where we're going to be having tonight a very thought-provoking chat. We're going to focus on defining colorism, the impact of colorism on the different racial and ethnic groups. We're going to talk about albinism, how light-skinned people of color and colorism impacts their daily lives. We're going to look at discrimination, belonging, exclusion with regard to the workplace, in society, and in education. We're going to also examine the psychological, emotional, physical, and social traumas of colorism that light-skinned people experience. We're going to look at Dr. Hall's critical skin theory. We're going to also focus in on discussion with the bleaching syndrome and the discussion of the most significant case involving a light-skinned Black woman who experienced colorism in the workplace, which was Walker versus Secretary of the Treasury, also identified as the Morrow case. And we're going to look at the EEOC's definition of skin color discrimination, which is also known as colorism. So I'll begin by introducing our distinguished panel. I'll begin with Dr. Ronald E. Hall, who is a distinguished scholar of colorism, and he's known as the father of colorism. He's a professor in the School of Social Work in the College of Social Science at Michigan State University. Dr. Hall's research spans years focusing on colorism and skin color globally. His research actually comprises more than 300 co-authored publications, interviews, and presentations pertaining to the issue of colorism. Of note are commentaries on Justice Clarence Thomas and President Barack Obama via Time Magazine, the Oprah with Oprah Winfrey, via the Color Complex, and in 2015, Dr. Hall was featured in Bill Duke's Blight Girls documentary, which was hosted by the Oprah Winfrey Network. His notable book credits include The Color Complex, which was revived in 1992 and was originally published in 1992 and revised, I think, in 2013. In 2003, Dr. Hall won the Melanin Prize for Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship for his publication of Skin Color as a Post-Colonial Issue Among Asian Americans. He also published recently Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Colorism Beyond Black and White, and that was in 2002. He also has a forthcoming book, The Routledge International Handbook on Colorism. And other than that, Dr. Hall's lectured extensively globally. Most importantly, as I noted earlier about the Morrow case, Dr. Hall was the expert witness for that case. That was the nation's first African-American colorism litigation. And it was out of Atlanta in the Federal District Court in 1990. On select occasions, since he has served as consultant for attorneys in need of colorism expertise. And other than that, we have named the Ronald E. Hall Conference on Colorism named after Dr. Hall. We also have the Ronald E. Hall Colorism Research Scholarship, and we'll be launching the Colorism Institute named after him this summer. It is because of Dr. Hall's work, his efforts, the research that opened doors for many of us in the field of colorism. Prior to him stepping out and conducting the phenomenal research that he's done, you really didn't hear colorism being mentioned, especially in academia. My next guest, and pardon me, everyone, is Dr. Neha Mishra, who is Associate Professor of Law and Associate Dean at the Jindal Global Law School, OP, Jindal Global University in India. She has previously worked as a founding director of the School of Legal Studies at Reva University in Bangalore, India. She has actively provided pro bono legal assistance to marginalized women, labor, and street children in rural and urban setups. She has also conducted special training workshops for police officers, prosecutors, as well as judges and magistrates in India. Her research focuses on human rights law, colorism, post-colonial feminist studies, gender and child rights, and its intersection. Her opinions and contributions can be seen in Time Magazine, BBC, Asia Times, Huffington Post, Times of India, as well as the other international journals. And she is also co-editor of the Routledge International Handbook of Colorism with Dr. Hall. She has been part of important deliberations with field experts throughout the country. She is also a member of the Colorism Project and Colorism Institute, and she's taken a role with us as the new editor of the Journal of Colorism Studies for research articles. My next guest is Professor Christian Long, who is a scholar, activist, and a doctoral candidate and instructor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Georgia, where she teaches a course on colorism and hairism in communities of color. Her research assesses the psychological and physiological impact of intraracial skin tone discrimination on Black Americans, theories on colorism, colorist stereotype formation and internalization, and transmission of intergenerational and cultural trauma. Her past research has examined how light-skinned Black women experience in-group colorism, and in her multi-article dissertation, she draws upon connections between historical and contemporary by presenting a novel socio-historical and theoretical framework. In her work, she asserts that without a proper socio-historical framework and more complete empirical understanding of skin tone discrimination, there will continue to be a loss of valuable knowledge and insight regarding the continued prevalence and the impact of colorism trauma on Black Americans of all complexions. She, as I noted, she's a doctoral student. She's also has an upcoming article published in the Journal of Colorism Studies, which will be coming out shortly. We're finalizing that as we speak. So welcome, I guess. Okay, so today we're going to begin this session with looking at the definition of colorism. I'm quite sure several of you have looked around on the internet, even with major dictionaries online. The description of colorism is always leading back to it being discrimination based on skin tone, where they're basically saying it only involves either A, Black Americans, or B, people with dark skin tone. So what we're going to do today as we begin this fireside chat is look at some of the definitions, talk about them, and I think it's important that we understand what colorism is. I say that in the context because today there was an article on the Atlanta Black Star on Facebook where they were attacking a celebrity who I think described her skin tone as pecan brown. And as she noted, my skin tone is a pecan brown. And the, I guess, Twitter crew came for her, stating basically that's colorism. That because she described the color of her skin, that was a colorism act. So what I think is important to do as we host these fireside chats and doing the conference on colorism is to make sure that we understand what colorism really is, what it looks like. So I'll begin with the EEOC's definition of colorism on their website, or rather, skin color discrimination. And the EEOC defines it as, quote, color discrimination involves treating someone unfavorably because of skin color complexion, end quote. When you go to the Colorism Project's website, we've expanded that. And that expansion is based on an article, I believe, written by Trina Jones from Duke School of Law years ago when I was doing my research on colorism. So we're defining colorism as, and our guests will also weigh in on their definitions as well, where colorism involves a distinction based on skin color, where it can be light, medium, or dark, and results in either the favorable or unfavorable treatment of individuals based on the lightness or darkness of their skin color. Acts of colorism can occur consciously or unconsciously. They can be intentional and unintentional. It can lead to issues involving the psychological, emotional, physical, and social well-being of the victims. But I'm often also looking at exploring whether people who are perpetrating those acts, what is their psychological, emotional, physical, and social state as well? Because there has to be a reason why they're doing that. Colorism occurs intraracially and interracially. When it occurs interracially, that is the bulk of the colorism we have seen, I could say, in society with, let's say, for example, would be a white person looking at a darker complexion Black person or Indian person and treating them a specific way based on that skin tone, skin color. When we hear about issues in Hollywood where they're talking about where they only prefer light-skinned Black actors, that would involve a form of interracial colorism. Intraracial colorism is colorism that occurs within the race. So, for example, you can have two people who are Indian, two people who are Jamaican, they could be Asian, Black American, who are treating each other differently based on the lightness of darkness of their skin tone. There's also the issue of intra-ethnic colorism, where you have people of the same ethnicities participating in the behavior. Instances have occurred with interracial colorism, where you can have someone who may be Hispanic, Latino, they can be Asian, treating someone who is Black American and or any other group or ethnicity differently based on the skin tone. Okay, so having said that, I'm going to move in and go into our discussion with our guests, starting with you, Dr. Hall. How would you define colorism?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Colbreth, and to my esteemed guests. I have read many journal articles and books, and I constantly hear the issue of colorism, skin color, erroneously defined. My definition is closer to the EEOC. Typically, I listen to TED Talks, even shows like Good Morning America. You know, colorism is a popular issue now, but the people who are defining the issue are not the people that I know from the literature. And typically that definition pertains to discrimination against persons with darker complexions, what I call the dark skin as disadvantaged narrative. Simply put, colorism is defined on the basis of discrimination by melanin content. And it's not that lighter skinned Black people or persons of color have it easy. The point I'm trying to make is that they have a different set of issues. Oppression and pain is oppression and pain, regardless of the roots of that oppression and that pain. And it's like the definitions that I hear constantly are basically examples. If I ask you to give me a definition of a car and you tell me Toyota, you're not giving me a definition. A definition of a car might be a vehicle that runs on gas and has 4 wheels. So when I define colorism, whatever that definition might be, it must be a definition that covers the universe of colorism. And defining colorism on a basis of discrimination against dark-skinned persons is very limited, and that's an example, not a definition.
Really good. Professor Long.
I guess When defining colorism, I personally believe we should maintain the essence of the original definition created by Alice Walker in 1983, that it is prejudicial or preferential treatment of same-race people based solely on their color. And I personally love Alice Walker's definition, specifically because while she is considering contextually the experiences of Black women, the definition broad enough where it can encompass multiple genders and marginalized groups and the perpetuation of inter and intra-racial colorism. And so by her using the preposition of, and I am admittedly a bit of a textualist, but by her using of instead of something along the lines of by, the prejudicial or preferential treatment of same-race people based solely on color, she didn't limit the scope of the term. So in my opinion, there has not really been a need to redefine or debate colorism's meaning. Walker made it plain, and in doing so, she left room for more groups than just Black women to interrogate and call out colorism.
Very good. Dr. Mishra.
First of all, again, thank you so much, Dr. Kulbrat, for organizing this very, very vital fireside chat. To your question, I completely agree with Dr. Hall as well as Professor Long here. I personally feel I would get a little bit scandalous by stating that in most of the Asian continent and then global South per se, and in Indian continent, colorism right now is not even acknowledged. Even though we are one of the largest populated countries who ask still for fair brides or fair grooms when any marriage alliances even take place. So coming from a place in the world which do not even acknowledge colorism, I have just seen Western definitions of colorism. So whatever comes up with the literature of Western literature, which is there, because there is not ample literature which deals with the jurisprudential aspect of colorism per se, seen from beyond the Western lands. But of course, I completely agree with, as Professor Long was saying, Alice Walker's definition does not limit the scope. And as Dr. Hall was pointing out, I completely agree with that. Any kind of discrimination on the basis of melanin count or on the basis of skin color leaves good enough scope to incorporate people from any geographical, which goes beyond the geographical limitations.
Very good, thank you. So let me move forward and start by asking each of you, do light-skinned members of society experience colorism?
I think that is true. Well, as a matter of, well, let me back up. I've done several studies, and there are others who have done studies to indicate that persons with a lighter complexion do indeed experience discrimination. I was a clinical social worker before I entered the academy, and I have cases of individuals committing suicide, for example. The Oprah Winfrey documentary called Light Girls, there was an interview with a young lady who was not dark enough, so she kept applying these creams. She kept getting suntans and damaged her skin because she wasn't dark enough. One of the issues that lighter skinned persons experience is they're not considered authentically Black. And this means that they can frequently be excommunicated from their families. If you have a family of 5 children and one just happens to be lighter complected, she's probably going to be favored by the father, and her sisters and brothers are going to hate her for that when that has nothing to do with her personally. So a lot of light-skinned persons of color, African Americans, struggle with the issue of being authentically accepted as Black. Now, for those of us who never have our Blackness questioned, that's not an issue, and it almost seems trivial. But for people who live with that, who are stressed by that, it's an issue that few have been willing to acknowledge. And the last point I want to mention also, curiously enough, the first colorism discrimination case involving African Americans, and I'm always careful to say African Americans, that happened to be a light-skinned woman. it was Morrow versus the Internal Revenue Service. When the case started, she was Tracy Walker. But during the trial, she got married, so he changed her name to Morrow, which is why if you look the case up, you have to use those, remember to use those two surnames. But she had got into some difficulty with an African-American woman, darker complected, Ruby Lewis. She was from Louisiana, Creole country, and the color confrontation situation there goes back to the antebellum period. And she probably had some difficulty. The difficulty between the two was probably based upon that one person being lighter complected, based on the experience that Ruby Lewis had, and the other person, Morrow, was actually from Seattle, Washington, and traveled south to Atlanta, Georgia, to work for the Internal Revenue Service. But we aren't readily acknowledging the experience, I guess, because it just doesn't seem as painful or as difficult if you're a person of a darker complexion, because that's the most pronounced form of the colorism. I'll admit that, but it's not irrelevant to light-skinned persons.
Dr. Nia.
So I would just start off by saying that if you look at, I will speak with a caveat that I'm going to represent the Indian, jurisdiction and how diverse the society is. So this is my caveat, and with this, I will just talk about how light skin is perceived, and what do you mean by colorism of light skinned people in India. Now, primarily, as Dr. Hall said, even in Indian scenario, a person with light skin is always more desirable as a prospective love interest, as a prospective date. They are always perceived more educated than the darker counterpart and perceived to be of a higher caste. Now, caste system is very embedded in Indian scenario also. So generally, there remains a light skin preference in Indian diaspora, which is clearly visible through the arranged marriage advertisement done by different managers or social platform asking for fair bride or fair groom, etc. However, there is also a considerable part of population in Indian diaspora, like light-skinned members who might be suffering from disability like albinism or partial albinism or even vitiligo, who suffer extreme trauma, who suffer social exclusion and even seen as cursed. They do not get marriage prospects and so on and so forth. And even otherwise for lighter skinned members who are Indian, if you see, if for any reason they are immigrants like Asian American, etc., there have been studies conducted that I would say against the popular belief that there exists colorism of light skinned Indian men and women when they are stated to be not Indian enough in places where they are expected to be darker. And it has happened, which singles them out because, as Dr. Hall was pointing out, there remains hostility and constant hostility within the family members. This creates a social hierarchy within a family structure in private sphere as well as public sphere, where such people can be discriminated against. Light-skinned persons can be discriminated against the darker skin counterpart because they don't look Indian enough. And therefore, or maybe, okay, they're getting everything very easy. And that has a very long standing mental trauma and adverse mental health outcomes, such as even sometimes, even for their light skin, they feel that they are body shamed. It has led to, there are studies, a few studies which were conducted on Asian Americans in 2020. It was listed in PubMed. You will see that this kind of people, when they interviewed, they said that they were suffering from depression as well as suicidal considerations. So there are various coping mechanisms, but at the same time, I would definitely say with least hesitation that there exists discrimination even in Indian diaspora for light-skinned members.
Okay, thank you. Professor Long.
So I would definitely agree with Dr. Mishra and Dr. Hall. Light-skinned individuals do experience colorism. I know from my own research that I've conducted, it goes from experiencing like just brutal violence to also this threat of desirability and what the fetishization of light skin does within a community. And so I've talked to women that have notable traumas from just physical violence to also sexual assault that have been attributed to their complexion. And it's done a lot of damage to them individually, where they do have clinical mental health diagnoses and things of that nature that they personally attribute to their experiences. And so from hours of speaking with other light-skinned Black women and also taking my own experiences into account, an emphatic yes.
Okay, so Professor Long, let me follow back and ask you, what have your experiences been like with experiencing colorism?
My personal experiences?
Yes.
So, ooh, that's a thing. I have been dealing with that since I was young. So my sister and I are two of the lightest grandchildren on my mother's side. And so we've had to deal with colorist remarks, but also things through my childhood, you know, regarding, and excuse my language, I wouldn't be pretty if it weren't for my shit complexion. Having to fight coming through school, like physically fight, people trying to plot and plan and gang up, as well as being assaulted myself, and my skin complexion being something that was mentioned. So personally, my research is very much connected to who I am and not being able to see in the colorism research myself and needing to see if I was alone. I knew what me and my sister had gone through, but I needed to also know if there were other women that had experienced these things. And the more I dug and I just continued to dig, they came out of the woodworks and they were very candid. And unfortunately, their experiences mirrored my own.
Wow, that's interesting. Let's go back. Dr. Mishra, you noticed you mentioned albinism. And if we all remember last year's conference, we had a fireside chat with Dr. Hall and Ms. Vando Hoppa, who is an activist and a model. And she speaks up about albinism and how it impacts people in Africa. Dr. Hall, can you share or shed some light on how albinism is an issue and the connection with colorism?
Well, before I do it, I'd like to go back and just comment on something that Professor Long mentioned. Right now, I write constantly. So I have books that I've written that I'm in the process of getting published, and others that I'm thinking about. And I wrote a book on what I call reverse colorism a couple of years ago, and I'm having more trouble trying to get a publisher for that book than I had for the color complex. But one of the interesting things that I found out in doing the research for that book, Professor Long talks about sexual exploitation during the antebellum period. Mixed race, light-skinned African-American women, by the time they were 12 or 13 years old, just beginning to show the signs of womanhood, they were rounded up and sexually exploited, sold on open market as a norm. And that has not been acknowledged that I know of in a public forum anywhere. And until we confront that, acknowledge that, as long as we keep it hidden, it's just going to perpetuate the pain. And so I think that needs to be said publicly. Ms. Long's story needs to be told, or Professor Long's story needs to be told, and people need to be aware of it. There needs to be a conversation, particularly among light-skinned and dark-skinned women. I can talk about the exploitation or the pain that lighter-skinned African-American men endure, but we can save that for another conversation. But I think there needs to be some dialogue between light-skinned and dark-skinned women, particularly because women still are exploited for their physical, sexual attributes. And that doesn't get acknowledged. As pertains to albinos, I think the term Ms. Hopper told us she prefers to be called a person with albinism and not an albino. So I want to make sure that I'm politically correct with that. But that's just another branch of the discrimination that lighter complected persons experience. And I didn't know the extent. And I wrote a paper on the persons with albinism. And there's a tradition among some African cultures. In Tanzania, for example, if a child is born with albinism, then they're placed at the gate of cattle, and the gate is open. And if those children are trampled by the cattle and they die, then that ends the issue. But if they are trampled and they live, then they're accepted. And that's a norm. It's a tradition. People are still today in 2024 in some backward rural traditional areas in Africa still hunted. They make potions out of their blood and trinkets out of their blood, out of their bones. And if that's not pain, if that's not oppression of a light-skinned person, I don't know what is. That needs to be publicized.
It does, and it's I remember reaching out to the association here in the United States for people with albinism, and the response I received from the woman who's, I think is the CEO or the director, was just basically that colorism is not an issue for people with albinism. And it was disheartening because there are a lot of issues where they're treated so terribly. And we found out during that fireside chat, imagine them taking the bones of someone or hunting them for their limbs and using them as trinkets. But now things have changed where you have more people speaking out. I mean, there's still existing issues, but with Dr. Hall's research and article we wrote, and with Ms. Butt taking a stand, we're looking at seeing hopefully things change with that regard. Professor Long and Dr. Mishra, do you have anything you'd like to add more to the discussion on albinism?
I just wanted to address something Dr. Hall mentioned. So the historical sexual exploitation of the lighter skinned individuals, it was commonly known as like the fancy trade and very popular in Louisiana.
Yes.
And it's something that has not reached, I know, the sociological audience. And so it's something that I'm using to kind of bridge the historical and the contemporary to bring that in. And so it's really refreshing to hear you mention it, because I have not heard it mentioned. And when I talk to people about it, they're like, what? I'm like, yes, that was a thing. That was a thing.
They were called fancy girls.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, just to give you a very an example, now in Delhi, where I belong from, that is in the northern part of India. And if you see northern Indian skin tone, it is very different from what you will see in the southern part of India. So in southern part of India, you will see much more darker skin tone generally of people. So South Indian people are having darker skin tone. North Indian people, because the geographical conditions are different, they have much lighter skin tone. So when I am in North India, personally, I'm something, my skin color tone is called as something which only Asians, generally it's very popular amongst Indian, is wheatish. So I'm not called fair, but I'm called, okay, she's not fair, but she's wheatish. A fair person would be much more lighter in skin tone than me. I have a dark skinned father, and my mother has a very light skin. So of course, there is difference of skin tone even amongst us siblings. And as Dr. Hall was pointing out previously, there is this constant comparison. I have spent some considerable time in Southern India, and automatically the moment I go to Southern India, I'm considered very fair. And the moment you are very fair, there is this constant thought that, okay, this person is fair. And especially in a patriarchal society like India, the moment a woman is fair, there is this hypersexualization of that woman that, okay, this is a person which is more desirable. So it is okay to look at this person only with a specific manner. And this happens not only from the men, but also women. You will see even lighter skin tone or darker skin tone men and women objectifying more fairer skin tone person. Now, when you talk about people with albinism, I was giving an example of Delhi. There is a place in Wazirpur, which is not a very, which is a poorer area. It is economically weaker section of society live there. I know of a family. There was a lot of research done on that family. It's a family of 10. They had to move from southern India. They were all South Indians because they were people with albinism and this congenital effect, disability. They suffered, all the whole family suffered from it, because generally, if there is a person suffering from albinism in India, they will be outcasted. Nobody else will marry them. So somehow there was a woman and a man who ended up coming together. Now these are now around over 60-year-old. They have children, and all of them live together because two of their daughters are still unmarried, two of their sons are still unmarried in a one-room apartment. They had to leave South India and live in northern part of India, away from their culture, away from their language, because there are different language, there's different type of food people eat, only for the sole hope that they might be accepted more in the place of Delhi, which is northern part, and the skin color is still similar to the one you see in larger public. Now, they had to move their home, and there are 10 people who are living in a one bedroom house. And they said that they are constantly bullied and beaten even in streets in northern India. And there is no specific reason for that. Just because they might be playing on the street, the boys would be playing on the street, that is good enough reason for other boys to come together to just beat them or bully them. The girls are still unmarried. Sometimes, even as a slur, they are called as Angrez or Britishers, right? Because they look like the one who colonized us for the longest period of time and constantly humiliated because of their skin color. And they said, when they were giving an interview, they said they felt singled out. The daughters remain unmarried to date.
That is interesting. I have a question. Where do you think the discrimination or the treatment of people with albinism, where is that coming from? Like, what is bringing that to the service to such a degree that families are living in fear, people hunted down, they're murdered? Why is it that that stigma is attached to them when someone has albinism?
So my take on it is, originally we are the Dravidian race, and it's the same race, and the norm was to see darker skinned people. But historically, we were ruled for a very long period of time. First by Mughals, who came from the northern part, who were much fairer in skin tone. And that is the reason the races got mixed up in northern part of the region, where there were more invasions and Mughals were leaving more, and there were mixed race people. The southern part, they didn't reach as much. Then, of course, after that, for over 300 years, the Britishers ruled us. So constantly we saw ruler class with lighter skin tone, and there is this idea of superiority and power, which is attached to the lighter skin. So this white supremacy idea, and therefore this constant need of assimilation, that we want to be that person who holds the power, who is more superior. And self-internalization of white supremacy is where this idea comes from. Now, taking from this experience, when you look at the people with albinism, of course, it's a rare disease, right? Rare, I would not call it, I'm so sorry, disability, because it has attached after effects of maybe deteriorated eyesight and many other impacts. Now, when you are talking about persons with albinism specifically, again, the number of that was so low that anything that you don't see as a norm will raise eyebrows and there will be less acceptability. However, when you saw generically a ruler class with lighter skin, you want to associate it with that. But when you are primarily darker and you see 2 or 3 people who do not belong, then they are outcasted. And therefore, this inherent exclusion and singling out and bullying and ostracizing them follows. So in India also, it is just like in sub-Saharan, African countries, albinism is seen as a curse. If there is a woman with albinism, she would be stated that, okay, she is a witch. They have superpowers. They have magic. We need to stay away from them, never marry them. They are witches, etc. So these are the kind of very common phenomena which I see.
Thank you. Dr. Hall, what from as far as your research, what have been the experiences of people with albinism in the United States compared to, let's say, someone in Africa?
You know, there isn't much on that issue here in the United States. I can only speak from my personal observations. I haven't done any research on albinism in the US per se. And the lady who is the head of the Albinism Association that you mentioned earlier, I called her and she wasn't too happy to receive my phone call. She took what I had to say as criticism, but I was simply trying to advocate. I think we don't have a lot of experience with individuals who have albinism in our country. I've known one person in my lifetime who was a person with albinism, but I didn't get the impression that the discrimination that they may have experienced was due to the implications of light skin, but rather viewing albinism as a dysfunction or a medical issue. So maybe there's a little difference between how the issue is regarded in the US versus Africa. I mean, I don't know in African-American culture of any curses, for example, associated with a person with albinism here. And maybe that's just the fact that I don't know a lot about that population, but I've not observed much.
Yeah. Okay. So moving forward, as we've noticed here in the United States, there have been instances, and if anyone checks, you'll find this on TikTok videos, you'll find it on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and other blog post comments, where some people have noted that only dark-skinned members of society experience colorism. And when light-skinned members of society experience colorism, skin color discrimination, that it cannot be identified as being a form of colorism. Now, before I go any further, before you respond, if we go back to the EEOC's definition of what the skin color discrimination is, which is also known as colorism, why is there this division when we start identifying or discussing experiences of people with light skin and people with dark skin? And why is there a belief that light-skinned people do not experience colorism or skin color discrimination?
I think I can just briefly comment on that. I think it's when individuals try to articulate the skin color issue based on their own personal experience versus the empirical research. So if you're a person who's of a darker complexion, it is no doubt you're going to be discriminated against going for a job interview. In the marriage market, there may be disadvantages. And from your personal experience as a darker complected person, that may not appear to be as challenging for lighter skinned persons. Now, I was a clinical person before I entered the academy, as I mentioned. I had always known as an African American the existence of colorism, but I found out later on that I'm what you would consider a more medium range person of African descent. It is the two polar extremes, the very light and the very dark is where the difficulty exists. So with my medium skin color, even though I was aware of colorism, I could be accepted by the very light and the very, as well as the very dark. But the two polar extremes, there's a lot of tension there. And so my experience, although I was aware of colorism, wasn't as painful as someone else who was very dark, who was very light. And again, just using my personal example, I have mixed race Indian in my family, Native American. My father looked Latino, and everything in our house reflected Africa. And it didn't dawn on me that he was trying to convince people, if you look at his kids, and my mother was a darker complected one, if you look at his kids and then look at his wife, you would never have to ask, what are you? And my appreciation for Blackness comes from my light-skinned father, not my dark-skinned mother. She took her Blackness for granted. And that's a whole different perspective on the issue.
It is. It's a big difference. Professor Long, what about you? What are your thoughts?
So, one, absolutely. I think that ultimately defining colorism, this just becomes particularly important in the context of the experiences of light-skinned individuals, because there are people who adamantly argue that light-skinned people can experience colorism. I've been met with a lot of that when I do presentations or when I present my work, and it becomes very sort of adversarial. People take offense to what I'm saying. I've been told that I am all lives mattering colorism and things like that. And a primary reason that I've been given is that colorism is systemic. And I think that's why understanding the word in its most simplistic form is essential. So as you mentioned, I teach a course called Colorism and Hairism in Communities of Color. And I've had a number of students meet me with the idea that it's not possible for colorism not to be this one-way unidirectional thing because of the systemic nature of it. And so I do an activity with my students called Colorism Decoding, where we break the word down to bring about a reconsideration of the definitions that omit light-skinned individuals. And so we take colorism and we break it down, color plus ism. And so some students are tasked with defining color, while others are tasked with defining an ism. And they Google or Bing away. And when defining color, one definition that has repeatedly been brought back to the large group discussion is that color is defined as the pigmentation of skin, especially as an indication of someone's ethnicity. And then the definition of ism is that it is generally articulated or refers to a distinctive practice, system, or philosophy. And so then we bring that together, and the definition that they generally come up with or tend to come up with is that colorism is the practice of discriminating on the basis of skin pigmentation. And what we hone in on is that while it can be systemic, we have to remember that in that definition of an ism, there's a conjunction or, and that it's not and, it's or, meaning that it ism can be a practice, a system, or a philosophy, and that they can be and exist without one of the other. And so rather than being mutually inclusive, they are mutually exclusive. And so the ism does not have to be systematized in order to qualify or constitute being called colorism. And so that's something that we talk about it and break it down. And so this notion that light-skinned people can't experience colorism is hinged up on the idea that colorism is automatically systemic. But when you break the word down, it doesn't have to be. It can be an attitude. It can be a philosophical notion. It can be systematically ingrained or systemically ingrained within institutions and institutional practices and actively practiced on the individual level at the same time.
I like to comment on something that someone just sent by way of the chat, making reference to the tragic mulatto. The tragic mulatto is exactly what I was talking about when I mentioned the difficulty that lighter skinned individuals experience. That is, you're tragic because you're not accepted as white and you can't be accepted as Black. And when that wears on you psychologically over time, it becomes a very painful experience. And also, I'd like to add, most of this conversation has been about the difficulties that women of color, African-American women, experience. But there's an element as pertains to African American men also. And that doesn't get a lot of discussion. And from my work on that topic, that issue, the simplest way to describe their difficulty, pretty boys are not accepted as men. And that's what they deal with.
That is true, Dr. Hall. That is a issue where at the conference this year, we are going to have discussions on light-skinned men and their experiences of colorism. And we hold the fireside chat. I think it's in July. That's going to be one of our primary focuses, looking at the experiences of light-skinned men and how they're treated. I know as far as colorism occurring in the workplace and people not believing that it was real, as a consultant, I've actually had employers say to me, I have two Black women. No, let me make sure I'm getting this right. 2 Black girls. So I first had to correct them that they're grown women. We don't refer to grown women as girls. That's the first thing. So I straightened the employers out about that. Then it was the issue of they could not embrace or wrap their heads around the fact that they're 2 women belonging to the same racial and ethnic group, treating each other differently based on the lightness or darkness of the skin tone. And back to Dr. Hall's point, I actually had to pull up the case Walker to help them understand. Despite the EEOC's language, despite the chart statistics from the EEOC of the increase in color claims, at one point in time, color claims with the EEOC were up 300%. And that was a lot. That's a lot. So employers were looking at this, an employer who's not a person of color, that there's no such thing as 2 Black women not getting along in the workplace, only mainly based on the skin color. Once he heard of the names that they were being called, back and forth, then it was like the light bulb went off in the head. I've handled cases where there's been a dark-skinned manager literally saying words that were just so inappropriate in the workplace to a light-skinned employee. I've had issues where one employee claimed that they suffered psychological, emotional, physical, and social trauma because of this. And that's what sparked my interest into looking at colorism with that regard, to such a degree where she obtained a lawyer and they were trying to look at her being able to go out of work on workers' compensation for the psychological trauma.
I have to say that when I testified in that case, I was shocked that the judge, Judge Moy in Atlanta Federal District Court, had no idea that this was going on. Now, Euro-Americans experience something I refer to as cultural singularity. Colorism started 1619 when the first Africans landed in Jamestown, and that they would not know that this was going on is attributed to the fact that they just don't have the ability to empathize with people outside of their own racial group. We, as Du Bois used the term double consciousness, I have the skills of an African American, but I have to also develop the cultural skills of a Euro-American because that's the standard. And so that gives me an advantage in understanding what's going on with other people. Euro-Americans don't have that experience.
It's so true. I wanted to bring up another point also when it comes to light-skinned people experiencing colorism. Is it that, now I'm going to bring this up with regard to Black Americans. Is it that there is the denial, the rejection, the refusal to accept that light-skinned people do experience colorism, mainly because we go back to that, your blues ain't like my blues. Say that in quotes. Is it because darker skinned people historically have experienced colorism, which has been more, let's say, out in the open, where they've been blatantly treated differently because of their dark skin? How can we, as colorism scholars, can we say that when a light-skinned person experiences colorism, that is colorism? There have been, and I asked that question because I've had so many, I'll say, arguments, disagreements with people on social media, where there's this dogged belief that how dare you as a light-skinned person say that you experience colorism because of your light skin. You have no right to say it's colorism or you're wrong because I'm dark-skinned and I've been there, I've been through. Does that make sense? I mean, what are we doing with this? Because I find it, I have an issue when I hear a Black person say, no, a Black person with light skin can never experience colorism. It's something else. Because if you dare try and label that as colorism, this is what I'm saying, this is quotations, it diminishes or takes away from my experience as a dark-skinned person who has experienced colorism. What are your thoughts? Professor Long, I see you looking like you're ready to take this one.
I've heard that a lot since I started doing what I'm doing. And in the most respectful way, it rings of like these sort of struggle Olympics, like a need to have the acknowledgement that you have had it harder. And a lot of it connects to history, like the history of Black Americans in this country. And so when I've heard individuals say, you know, well, light-skinned people can't experience that, it usually goes back to enumerated privileges and visual proximity to whiteness. But what people omit is that there are Black spaces or predominantly Black spaces that exist where Black people hold and wield power. We are not powerless. We have always been resilient. And we create these spaces where we can exact a sort of revenge. And I think that's the part that we negate. We minimize what we are capable of, that we can perpetuate, you know, the same sort of thing that has been enacted out against us. And so I've heard that a number of times. And again, it always goes back to like, well, y'all have this and y'all have that. But that's on a contextual basis. Like you really have to consider where this light-skinned individual comes from. You know, access and actualized advantage are very different. So yes, if I go and I navigate white spaces, I might gain some sort of benefit. But if all I know are Black spaces, where I am generally one of a few light-skinned individuals in a room, that can serve to disadvantage me in that particular space. And so I somewhat find those statements amusing, but I also understand where it's coming from, and that a lot of time it's coming from this sort of like this trauma that has been passed down. And that individuals still believe that light-skinned individuals are getting some of those benefits, and some are, but it's not universally applicable across, you know, the spectrum of light-skinned Black people in this country.
And at the risk of controversy, you know it had to happen. I think the current perception of colorism in this country is viewed through a white lens, because you have bought into the mulatto hypothesis, which suggests that if you're lighter complexion, if you're mixed race with white, you're smarter, you have more morals, you're more cultivated, versus a purely Black lens, which would look at colorism as an issue for people of color, for African Americans, for Asians, etc. It's just one version pertains to those who are lighter complected, and another version may pertain to those who are darker complected. But the the truly African lens, I would think, would not buy into the mulatto hypothesis. And that's been part of our problem in accepting that. You just assume things about a lighter skinned person in terms of what they think of themselves that may or may not be true. That's a white lens.
That's a good point.
This is where I think I would also jump in terms of Asian Americans. So generally, if you see among the Asian Americans also, you will see that fairer group of people are assumed privileged. So the ones who are lighter will not hear the end of how they're getting things easy, jobs much more easily, better packages, employment, and how they're passing off, right? Maybe as definitely sometimes even not Indians, and for them even to pass off as somebody who is a Latino, etc., is still, a step in the Eurocentric assimilation. Or there might be a constant comparison that they can easily get a marital partner, or how they do not look like one of the parent or sibling, causing eternal family rivalry or hostility. And there is this constant comparison. But a very interesting case study when I have myself interviewed two of my very, very good friends who are very light skinned, and one had hazel eyes and the other had green eyes. There is this notion in Indian diaspora that people feel if you are much more lighter skinned, you are not Indian enough. And sometimes that goes against you, where you're seen that, oh, this female, especially I will talk about, in terms of female, this female is not traditional enough. And then in a society like ours, which is patriarchal, it is also seen as, oh, she looks more westernized, she would not be chaste enough or with good character. So, which implies the person can be of loose morals. And how do they, interestingly and very ironically, how do they adjudicate that is just looking at that person and looking at the color of the eyes. So, oh, if this person has cat eyes or greenish eyes, the female would not be good enough to marry because she will have loose character. I don't see the connection between loose character and the color of your eyes, but the common perception. So they are good, very desirable to make a girlfriend. But again, in the arranged marriage setup, if you see a very light female, automatically that becomes a point of outcasting. So those are also the other contrast of colorism that you see within, Asian American, and especially with Asian American, because you want this sense of belongingness. If you are an immigrant, if you are a person who is not of that origin, you also want to be connected to your roots, as Dr. Hall was pointing out with his father and mother. So that sense of belongingness, if you do not see yourself to belong from your origins, then that is a sense which constantly creates a lot of social trauma.
True. So let me ask you this as we move forward. How does colorism impact light-skinned members of society? And can you provide me any examples?
Can you explain that again?
So how does colorism impact light-skinned members of society? How does it impact them? And let me expand on that question. From a psychological, emotional, physical, and social standpoint, how does it impact them with regard to in their personal lives, professional, in academia, as entrepreneurs? Are they going through issues?
Well, in all those areas, the flip side of their assumed advantages may pertain to skills and potential that they don't have. So if you are lighter complected and society says that you're smarter because you're lighter complected, but you're just an average student, that may be an issue that you have to deal with because you feel like you're minimum, or you don't have what the potential that's ascribed to you. And while we're talking about the issue of colorism as pertains to light skin, actually, There was one incident that I can think of where it was a much more of an advantage to be darker complected. And that pertains to a man by the name of Matthew Henson. And when the so-called explorers from the US went to the North Pole and they encountered indigenous people who had milky white skin, the one person amongst that group was an African-American from Baltimore, a dark complected man from Baltimore. And he was valued, absent Eurocentric influence, he was valued for his darker skin. And as pertains to issues of color, lighter complected as pertains to men, I mentioned a little earlier that those individuals who are lighter complected males are considered pretty boys, fancy boys, but they are not respected in the same way as a man by other Black men. And one of the scenarios I used to characterize that, I interviewed some professional athletes, and they have jokes about lighter skinned athletes in football or basketball. I'm quoting Kobe Bryant. He was telling a rookie, for example, when he played for the Los Angeles Lakers, quote, "Take it to the hole like a dark skinned dude," unquote, which simply means in I guess jock speak, be aggressive, be dominant, be a man. Because if you're a lighter complected athlete, you assume that you can be pushed around. Other darker complected athletes assume they can push you around and get more physical with you, and you have to prove yourself. Whereas if you're a darker complected athlete, you're just assumed to be more of a man. The one exception to that of a light-skinned male who embraced his light skin was the greatest. That was Muhammad Ali. And he bragged about being pretty as a girl. He didn't run from it.
Yeah, that's true. He did. He did. Professor Wong, your thoughts?
So well, firstly, I believe that colorism is impacting the light-skinned members of society in a variety of ways. And I know in my own research, there's been tales of violence and humiliation. For instance, there was a participant in my study who had her head smashed into a brick wall and face dragged along it with the intent that they would mutilate her face. I then had a participant who was stripped naked and publicly humiliated, women that were gang jumped, spat on, pushed down flights of stairs, bullied relentlessly, and additional people that were sexually assaulted. And they handled these things in a variety of ways. But what I found interesting is that all of the women that experienced colorism linked it back to stereotypes. And so they began to talk about the various ways that they tried to sort of make themselves less of a target when it came to that. And so they employed particular techniques to minimize the likelihood of them experiencing these things again. Nevertheless, they kind of suffered from this sort of like social paranoia and hypervigilance when they were around other Black individuals. And there was just this lack of trust that permeated the sort of like social atmosphere that ultimately did end up impacting their mental health. And it impacted some of the women so greatly that they crossed over ethnic lines and began to pass. So they left the Black community altogether for a time. And I spoke with women that ranged from age 18 to 93. And their stories, despite generational differences, were very, very similar. And just the overall impact of this sort of exclusion and rejection and the violence and how that all ultimately culminated into feeling very othered within the space and like they didn't belong. So it impacts each individual differently. And I've seen that with the different women that I've spoken to. Some have sort of taken on this rebel idea of like, you know, I'm just gonna fall into it and embrace it. Whereas others have tried to really distance themselves altogether.
To you. Go ahead, Dr. Hall.
Well, I was just going to mention Professor Long's comment about passing. That's another significant issue as pertains to skin color. You know, if you're lighter complected with physical features of a person of European descent, well, there were opportunities and there were options. Men could pass, but women weren't so given to passing because a woman's background had to be established for her to successfully pass. But a light-skinned man from Mississippi left his family and moved to Washington, the state of Washington, he could become white. And that's how a lot of Black blood is entered into white families through this issue of passing. Or you might have permanent versus temporary passing, where in Harlem, New York, for example, a person may live in Harlem, but during the day for work, they go to Manhattan, where they would pass as white and come back home to the Black community after work.
Yeah.
That was an option that was available to lighter skinned people that obviously wasn't available to persons of a darker complexion. But that's very significant in its issue in the history.
That is true. My question, do you think that, let's say, for example, if a woman says she's fair skinned, she identifies as being a Black woman, and then you have a dark skinned Black woman who says, who in the blank do you think you are? You're identifying as a Black. I'm Black. This is Black. And I've actually witnessed this, where the individual said to the lightest skinned woman, this is Black. I don't know what the bleepity bleep you think you are, but I'm offended with the way you look, that you're identifying yourself as a Black woman when this is what Black looks like.
You know, I don't seek out controversy, but sometimes it just happens that way. I want to go on record as saying, Black is not a color. It's a state of mind. It's
That's
a
right.
culture. It's a tradition. If you look at pictures of slaves going back to the 1800s, compare that to a typical African American today, looking like Beyonce, for example, and Beyonce is no less Black than anybody else. So our characteristics, our physical features are going to change over time based on proximity to other racial groups. And we have to acknowledge that and stop trying to define Blackness by a single color. I think that's a disservice.
I agree, Dr. Hall, 100%. There's too much of that going on, where I'm seeing on social media, where they're really literally going back and forth over how dare you say you're Black. You don't know what it's like.
Yes.
And it bothers me because we're all scholars in this field. And I'm saying to myself, there's not a set standard that you have to meet to be a Black or African American person at all. But are we causing more of the problems? Well, let me phrase this correctly. Let's look at Black Americans first, and then we'll look at other groups. Are Black Americans causing more of the problems with colorism within the race when they are telling the lighter skinned individuals that they don't fit in, or you have no right to say you're Black? Are we causing those problems as opposed to someone else outside of the group? Here's where I'm trying to go with this. When you look at colorism from an interracial perspective, pardon me, that is when, of course, we know someone outside of the group, that racial ethnic group, treating the other person differently. But when we have people belonging to the same racial, let's say African American, Black, however you want to categorize it, same group, treating each other differently based on that skin tone. So stay with me here. That's part A. So it's within the race, interracially. But from an interracial perspective, well, let's say a white person may treat a darker skinned Black person unfavorably because of their dark skin. Then when we switch and go back and look at the Black individuals doing it among themselves, what is the problem? Are we perpetuating it because it was experienced and it keeps moving on? Like, is there a psychological connection there? I'll say, Professor Long, I can see that look on your face. I can tell when she's like, let me do this with Dr. C.
I just want, I guess pop culture reference. I feel like Jay-Z said it best in his song, The Story of OJ. no one knows, then you can go look up the song and read the lyrics. But he basically lets you know that light or dark, it doesn't matter. You still are
Yep.
what the white community says you are.
Yep.
And we know that historically the rule of hypodescent, the one drop rule, one drop you black. And although it is now defunct and not something that we technically have to live by, Black people do. And so I do believe that we do more damage to ourselves by continuing to perpetuate it. So
Yep.
there are a number of studies that talk about the impact of colorism, but there are recent studies that are coming out that are saying that for specifically Black Americans, intraracial colorism is more physically damaging for us than interracial. That intraracial colorism is a viable form of discrimination that may very well even excel or go beyond the impact of everyday discrimination and these other forms of discrimination. And so I think we do more damage, absolutely, by perpetuating it ourselves. There are some who believe that the Willie Lynch letter is real, some that believe it was written by the Black Panthers in the 70s, to each his own, but it rings of truth. Regardless of the time frame. And I think that is what has happened, and that we have internalized these white supremacist ideals, and that we then perpetuate the harm. We become the perpetrators of our own oppression, and then we continue to replicate it. We pass it down to our children. I have a sister who, when she was in the first grade, a group of girls said, we don't like you because you light skin. Like, it's that type of stuff. Like, why are first graders saying things like that? And it's like, because they're taught. They're taught these things. We teach these things in the Black community. We perpetuate these stereotypes, and it goes to the next generation. And so I think that more harm is done by our perpetuating it and our continuing to hold on to these colorist stereotypes and imbibing them and allowing them to continue. It does more damage, we're finding out, than anything essentially that like the white people may be doing in a white supremacist society.
That's right. I remember couple years ago, and I think it was a Tom Joyner, he would have a cruise and they would have competitions, light skin versus dark skin on the cruise, or comments being made. This is how light skinned people act at Thanksgiving. This is how dark skinned people act. And we were doing this. Black people were doing this. So Dr. Hall, your point.
Well, I was just going to say, look at social media sometime and look at some of the posts of team light skin and team dark skin. And we've already begun ascribing light skinned people, light skinned men, for example, you're so light skinned is a person that's emotional. We're attaching a reality to it that has no basis in fact, but it's just reinforcing that dichotomy. And we do that ourselves.
Dr. Mishra, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree with Professor Long and Dr. Hall here. This is very systemic. And I just want to add that colorism, again, it's beyond a particular race. It is very universal. I have done my study in Global South, at least in Asian countries as well as in Africa. And if you look at Global South, colorism is attached with so many other cultural problems that come with it. So you do talk about skin color, but then when you attach it with the vulnerability of a lower caste, a vulnerability of your economic position, there is more likelihood. And then if you are a female, then again, your probability, this vulnerability becomes multifolded. So one thing that I want to, emphasize specifically, without the Western lens keeping in mind, I mean, to give it an inclusive voice with respect to colorism, is that it is universal. And there are other problems that get associated with it. From a Western perspective, it is only seen as a race issue. But as Professor Long was saying, it is more problematic intraracial. So in India, in Global South, amongst African subcontinents, within Indonesia, within Philippines, you would not see the problem of race per se.
That's right.
At the same time, colorism persists. So there is still discrimination based on skin color. And the vulnerability will multifold with the other social and cultural taboos that are attached to it. You come from a lower caste, and if you have darker skin, and if you are from poor family, if you are an untouchable, that girl's parents will not be able to pay the dowry for that girl's marriage, and therefore as soon as such a girl is born, she's seen as a burden from her birth. So she is more likely to be sold off as a child bride, which in legal terms we call it as trafficking. So you're more, there is more likelihood of that girl to be trafficked if she is dark skinned. So there are, multitude of problems that are attached to it, which are culturally very, very relevant. So
And if I can add to what Dr. Mishra indicated as pertains to the universality of this issue, when I testified in Atlanta, Georgia, I was fearful that people might associate this issue exclusively with African Americans. So I took my own funds and I began taking trips. I've covered the entire planet, not every country in the world, but I covered the entire planet in terms of racial categories, and I've not found one group of people where this colorism issue is not relevant. The only difference is you have nuances amongst the various groups, but the colorism, color means something, and usually the darker, the more denigration. I even found that with the Native American group in North Dakota. They have special terms for words, special words and terms for people who are dark or of African descent. And look at some of the literature on what's called red-black Cherokees, and they are treated differently versus Cherokee Indians mixed with Caucasian. So it's not talked about, it's not very open and into the public, but it's definitely an issue, and it's definitely universal.
You're right, Dr. Hall. So should colorism be included in the DEI literature? Is it something? And I bring this question up. I teach DEI in race classes, and none of my colleagues incorporate colorism in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when I brought it up and said, we need to be talking about colorism, he looked at me as if I was, green in the face or something was wrong. But I incorporated in my classes mainly because I'm teaching managing a diverse workforce. Colorism issues are popping up in the workforce. So if my students, I'm responsible for teaching you how to manage a diverse workforce. So now you're a manager, you finished Dr. C's class, you deal with the issue of colorism and you're sitting there like, what? Because a lot of training in the workplace is not mentioning colorism. Why? I don't know, but it's not. So my question I pose to all of you is, should colorism be included in the DEI literature in discussions and in training?
Well, for me, you're going to getting a resounding yes, 1,000 times yes. One of the things I've been advocating for is the complete elimination of race, R-A-C-E, from any manner of discourse. Race is contrived, it's subjective, it's not something that you can measure. Everywhere that we have race referred to in law, statutes, and policies, I want that replaced with color, skin color, because you can measure that. Unfortunately, we're going to have discrimination, but when you try to categorize race, you're just making something up. And when you talk in context of race, then that facilitates polarization, and people march off into their various corners and their various groups, and they take a position based on what's good for them racially and what's in opposition to them racially. But if you measure discrimination, for example, by skin color and DEI, that's subjective. A person who has 1 milligram of melanin in their skin versus one who has 2, well, the latter has twice the amount. And when you look at race, if Caucasian race is 1, black is 2, that's like X and Y. And X is not twice the value of Y because it's subjective. So you get into debates that really take us nowhere. You may not like what I conclude on the basis of colorism, but I'm using objective, empirical, mathematical measure. And I want to see race eliminated. It'll be a term in a dictionary that refers to an athletic event. That's the end of it. As long as we continue to use it, even when we speak against it, we are reinforcing the reality of race. So we're buying into something that's counterproductive.
That is true. Professor Long and then Dr. Mishra, what are your thoughts on including colorism in that DEI literature and discussions and training?
I personally think that it should be included. Similar to the Walker case, I did interview women who talked about experiencing colorism in the workplace and how there was like no verbiage for what they were going through in that space. And it was something that was just really kind of like, nah, it's just y'all just have, a little personal issue with each other. Like you must have done something to upset them. This sort of inference of light skin guilt, like you have done something. And so I think that including it in the literature will give not only lighter skinned people, but people of all complexions, what they need to kind of move forward in that particular area, because the intra-racial, the intra-ethnic, like that is very real. And by not including it, we're discounting its impact.
Good, thank you. Dr. Mishra.
So absolutely, yes. Color is something that must be included in DI education. In India, I'm a law professor. Article 15 of Constitution gives a non-discrimination clause of the Indian Constitution. And as it goes right now, the Indian Constitution forbids any discrimination on grounds of religion, race, caste, gender, and place of birth. And even till now, there is no mention of color in it. And that is the reason when you do believe in rule of law, but if your non-discrimination clause is not even acknowledging any discrimination which happens on the basis of color, then you are in turn promoting any kind of or disregarding any kind of discrimination which may happen on the basis of color. Yes. There are already studies which prove that there is a direct link to discrimination on the basis of color, and it can lead to preferential treatment in your job, employability, marriage, social situations, as well as economic and psychological impacts of your life. And if that is so, it is time that it should be included as a part of not just DEI, but I would advocate that it should become a part of at least my law. So, and then that should percolate into the DEI as a consequence of the law that is established in the country. So I am still advocating for its inclusion in the Constitution under the non-discrimination.
Yeah, I agree. I think when I started incorporating it, it was frowned upon. I don't like frown on it. It's okay, you can frown, but it has to be taught. With my background in HR and employee relations, and all of the times when I would see, and when I say this, everyone, I would get in my car to drive home and I'd be like, I need a drink. And I don't drink. I really don't drink liquor at all. And I would get in my car and I'm driving and I'm saying, I need a drink. These people, and I'm flipping, going through issues because I'm saying, you're not including it. So now when I'm teaching it, I incorporate it. One issue I did do was I sent to the VP of diversity at my institution. They sent out a newsletter and had the definition of colorism as only against dark-skinned people. So being that I'm in the field, I sent a very nice email and said, in a very nice way, I wasn't even rude or aggressive or whatever. And I said, your definition of colorism is incorrect. Colorism, is not only dark-skinned. People victimized. And why in the world did I do that?
Well,
Okay, Dr. Hall.
I can tell you some stories about when I started writing about this issue. People were questioning my sanity literally, but it was because of the case in 1990 that people kind of backed off. But if you want to validate or legitimize colorism now, since my case, there's been hundreds of cases filed. So
Right.
that's entered into legal documentation, and I would imagine that it'd be kind of difficult to refute that. So it's not as bad as it was. It's gotten better, but there are still people in 2024 who have no idea that this goes on.
Yeah, they don't. I've had
The clue.
I've had people say to me, "What? Are you kidding? There's no way." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's real." And I think for me, because I mean, what started my journey into colorism is I worked at a life insurance company in Baltimore, Maryland, years ago, and my manager literally called me in one day and just told me, "You look funny, you talk funny." She was a very dark-skinned Black woman, and I'm from Jersey. She's in Maryland. I think I talk like everybody else, in Maryland. And she called me in and she said to me, "You look funny, you talk funny. Look at your skin." And I'm like, "Oh, no, she did not." And that was my first experience with colorism. Then I was a law clerk at a law firm in Baltimore City. And while I was a law clerk there, cases were coming in with colorism. And the lawyer was like, "Hey, Donna, I got two Black guys." And this is exactly what he would say to me. "I got two Black guys, and they're going at it about who's lighter, who's darker, and calling each other names. Have you ever heard of this?" And I'm like, "Yes." And then after that, when I ran into Dr. Hall's work, when I realized and found out about Dr. Hall and his research, that opened the door. And I was like, "Okay, it's all over now, people," because it is real. And when I was doing research, I found back from I can't remember, 63 or 64, they were on the House floor and it was Representative Abernathy. And they were talking about color, skin color discrimination. Where a white member, I think it was in Congress, I'm not sure, but it's in my dissertation, asked him, "Do you mean that Black Americans, Black people and Negroes, whatever the word, he used the N-word, treat each other, discriminate against each other based on the color of their skin?" And Representative Abernathy confirmed that yes, lighter skinned Black people were not hiring darker skinned Blacks, and if there were issues. So Dr. Hall was right. This goes way back. And it was kind of pushed under the rug and not discussed. Then when all the lawsuits started coming up, the judicial system was basically perplexed as to how to handle them. I remember Dr. Hall, they were filing them as national origin, or what was the other one? Can't remember. They were filing colorism claims under the wrong category, so they were not prevailing.
Yeah.
So, but here's a question I want to ask everyone, and then we can open it up for questions from our audience. If I have a preference of dating someone, let's say, for example, my preference is to date someone of Michael Jordan's skin tone. And I say to all of us in the room, I'm like, I only like to date guys that look like Michael Jordan. Am I participating in a colorism act because I have a preference to date men that skin color? Is that colorism?
I don't know if I would call that colorism per se. I would have to think about the reason why you want to date that dark-skinned man. If you think you want to date him because his dark skin makes him better, because you could be attracted to a tall man, an educated man, an uneducated man. You wouldn't consider that an ism. But if you think a light-skinned person or a dark-skinned person is more attractive or more eligible because they're light-skinned or dark-skinned, I would consider that colorism.
Good. Dr. Mishra and then Professor Long, what are your thoughts?
Now, I would just add to Dr. Hall, when it is an individual preference,
Mm-hmm.
that in itself may not qualify as colorism. However, when you see that as a pattern in a larger population, and you
Yeah.
can reflect on that with your sample studies.
Yeah.
So I have conducted studies all over India and amongst Asian Americans. What I saw was that there was a clear pattern
Mm-hmm.
when I asked them the question, can you define pretty? So the answer of it was coming as somebody who is fair or light skinned. And when I asked the question, whom would you date? And there were images given of the same person with different shade of skin. And if there is a pattern, 60% of the total sample had chosen the lightest two shades of skin. So when you directly see a pattern of preference, then that preference is owing to something which is there, which is internalized amongst you as a society. That particular trait is seen as more desirable. And constantly, media doesn't help. The $400 million fairness market doesn't help. So all these ideas 24/7, you see media depiction of lighter skin, especially even in my country, all the models for a country which is darker skin toned, you see all the models, all the heroines, all the heroes to be very light skinned.
It's true.
You see constant fairness market which says that, okay, buy this product, then you will be pretty. And if that is a result of that desirability that you want to then date somebody, and your preference is being rooted through that particular, systemic internalization, then I would say somewhere it is connected to colorism.
Okay, good. Professor Long?
I agree with Dr. Hall and Dr. Mishra. I think that it's not automatically colorism. I think we have to ask why, and we need context, and then that individual needs to ask themselves why. So, like using your example, if a woman is like, oh, I only want dark-skinned Black men, then she needs to ask herself why that is. Are there potential stereotypical linkages? Is it because you may assume that he is more masculine or more virile? Like what's actually going on? And so I don't think that it is automatically colorism, but I definitely think that individuals we need context from the outside, and that they also need to examine the why behind it. In one of my manuscripts that'll be going up under review shortly, it's called "But Am I a Fetish Though?" And it's the conversations that light-skinned Black women are having when they are on the dating market and dating Black men, and they're like, well, I only like red bones, or I only like light-skinned Black women. And them having to combat and deal with that and kind of shut it down at the door. What do you do? And then if they don't voice those things, that voice in the back of your head still wondering, like, are you with me merely because you deem me better because of my skin tone? And then how do I react to that sort of situation and prejudicial behavior? So yeah, not automatically, but we definitely need context, and we have to ask why.
We had I think she was a psychologist for an issue in the workplace. And it was escalating. And when she came in and she talked about it, getting deeper with the employee and the issues that were going on. And the employee was just like, no, I just like dark skin. I'm not saying light skin is bad. I just like dark. This is in a report. And I was only privy to this because it was a legal lawsuit, and I was working as a law clerk, so I had to read everything. And it was the employee stated, I'm just attracted to dark skin. I don't know why, but I am. The psychologist came back, and if I remember correctly, and I hope I get this right, she found nothing wrong with that. That some people just like, they have preferences. And I think, I wish I could find that. I think someone was trying to push the issue that it was colorism. It was like, no, I just happen to look up and that's what I like. So I think that's the issue. I also think, and you brought up earlier about belonging, Professor Long, and how colorism can be an exclusive issue in the workplace. And it is. When people are treated differently in the workplace because of that skin color, that skin tone, that's exclusion. And this is why I push and argue for it to be included in the DEI field. Because remember, we're talking about authenticity, discrimination, we're talking about a sense of belonging and exclusion, not to mention the psychological, emotional, physical, and social well-being issues that are attached to someone being judged because of the color of their skin. So I'll ask everyone, my panel, Dr. Hall, do you want to talk about critical skin theory before we open it up to
Well,
questions?
I don't think it needs a lot of dialogue. Just simply put, I've advocated that everywhere we use race, just replace it with skin color complexion. So what the authors of critical race theory were referring to was the significance of race, and I'm simply saying the significance of skin color operates in the same fashion.
Excellent. Okay, Professor Long or Dr. Nia, would you like to say anything else before I open it up for questions from the audience?
We can take questions.
I'm sorry?
I said we can open
Okay,
for questions.
I'm going to open up. Would anyone have a question? You can raise your hand, or hold on, I'm going to give everyone access so you will be able to speak. You're now being given access. You're going on camera. So if you do not want your face on the camera, remember, we are recording this session, then you can turn your camera off. If there's anyone who does not want to go on camera, please let me know now. Send me a message, because I'm opening this up to everyone now. Give me 1 second. I'm going a little slow with this. I think everyone now has the ability to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and let which guest know who you're addressing with your question. Nicole.
Hello, can you see me and hear me?
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. I have a few things that I wanted to mention. So I did write myself a note, so I won't be rambling. Sorry, hold on. Okay, so I do appreciate the textual approach that Professor Long has taken, and I'm reminded of Ralph Ellison's the part when when he's in the riot, the rent riot towards the end, and he starts to become completely disillusioned with all notions of Black racial solidarity. He calls his, I believe his landlady, "you wasted piece of yellow." And so I can sort of connect to that because I've noticed that since, especially when we moved over to COVID, okay, myself being light skin with green eyes with a very tightly coiled 4C hair texture, I have experienced the combination of both colorism and texturism. Often the texture of my hair or just the appearance of my hair seems to elicit more annoyance and general disgust, because they're like, she's so light skinned, she doesn't even try to do her hair, that kind of thing. And so it seems like I get a lot more pushback because of that. Also because of my skin tone being more towards the pink side, and teaching it at HBCU, teaching race courses and visual rhetoric courses. I've had, and because Mac doing what it does with his computer lighting, students would not even recognize me as Black. And I noticed when we moved towards virtual face-to-face that sudden distancing from the student population really became so pronounced. I had never experienced that in my teaching at HBCUs. And then there's this other situation. I want to say, as a small child, I recall just sort of, being this blonde haired, light skin, super coily, 4C hair black girl, and the only light skin, the lightest out of all my sisters, even having a twin sister with brown hair and brown skin and brown eyes. And adults coming up to me and sort of when like my parents weren't there or any of my older sisters weren't there to protect me, saying, I bet you're evil, aren't you? With those green eyes, I bet you, and saying things like that. And I'm thinking as like a 4-year-old or 5-year-old child, like, I can't believe adults are saying, and not really registering until much older. And I think playing into sort of an experience I've had where I've always been distrustful of authority figures for that reason, maybe. Because, I could think of maybe 3 or 4 books off the top of my head in African-American literature where people with green eyes and blue eyes are considered evil, or just like a major thorn in the side or the antagonist in the story. And so I just wanted to bring that up. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Thank you. Amar and then Angela.
Hi all. Firstly, thank you so much for defining the colorism. And I have these questions. So how does colorism affect individuals' access to opportunities in education, employment, and other areas of life, especially here in the United States?
I can give one simple answer to that. Early on, when you were applying for an HBCU college, the university required you to send out a picture. And without making reference specifically to skin color, they could tell what color you were based on your picture. So it was very much a part of the educational process that probably still with us today in other unspoken ways.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Hall. Thank you.
Yes.
Angela. Angela.
She's muted.
I can't, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I apologize. Sorry, I just wanted to say just thank you all for sharing your perspective so far. This has been really, eye-opening and, informative and really good to hear what everyone has to say. My specific question would be to Dr. Hall, if he could explain what he means by reverse colorism. I mean, in my mind, I kind of compare that term to reverse racism, which is really kind of an oxymoron from, my understanding. So I was just kind of curious, is like what you mean by reverse colorism, or is it kind of more like almost like a sarcastic type reference?
Well, what I was really trying to describe was the colorism that light-skinned persons experience. Because as I indicated, it's an error, but the assumption is that when you talk about colorism, it's discrimination primarily against people who have a dark complexion. Well, when you have discrimination against people who have a lighter complexion, I'm seeing that as the reverse of that. And it's something that's really kind of new. So the language may not always be there, but that's the best term I could come up with, is reverse colorism.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, I had shared that my my cousin has biracial children, and her son has shared with her that he has a hard time fitting in, based on the fact that he doesn't feel like he's white enough or black enough, and he is still, he's in his early 20s, so he's still kind of finding his way. And what do any of you have any I don't know, words of wisdom about that, or advice, or anything that I could pass along to, say, my cousin, to share with them, because she has struggled with knowing how to support him and what to say?
Well, I would surround him with literature that emphasizes the contributions made by people I consider Black heroes. Look at Thurgood Marshall. Look at W.E.B. Du Bois. Look at a lady actress by the name of Lena Horne. These individuals were as black could be. So when he begins to see himself in some of these individuals, I think he would have a better time of realizing his self-esteem and his blackness.
I agree. This is Stacy Brown speaking. Having had to go through that at some point, probably, I don't want to compare myself to others, but having had to be in the middle, it became a point as I became a young adult, probably around this age, that I had to own who I was. And that, yeah, I have this sandy brown, as people call hair, or blondish color hair, and, you know, all the names that they call the red bones, all that, and say, well, this is uniquely me. And once I started looking at that, this is uniquely me, and learning about my ancestry and my history, who I am and who I come from, that made me stronger, where anybody could say anything to me now and it doesn't matter. And then I was overweight, and then I lost weight, and then it just became a snowball of different things. That once one thing was, I was farming, like, okay, I know I'm very light, even till now. I mean, even all the people of color that I am around me from different nations, they joke with me. I know they joke, but they still say, you're European descent, when I'm not. But we joke about it, but I got to a point, none of that bothers me, because I, again, read, and as Dr. Hall said, surrounded myself about people who were more knowledgeable about this and more open-minded about it, to help me understand you are uniquely you. You cannot care what others think, but you can either participate in helping, you know, break down the thoughts, the negative thoughts around it. And I know that's difficult for a teenager, because it's a lot of pressure to want to fit in somewhere. And even my own family were pretty, I'm not going to say bad critics, but they did it in a jest, but it was hurtful sometimes, because they think it's jokingly, you know, a joke. But when you're around people outside of that and they reinforce those thoughts, you do internalize it. You
Just remember, your color doesn't make you black.
Right, exactly. Right. But until you know, you don't. And so you're internalized, like, oh, I'm no fit anywhere, you know.
I can share with you, I remember my neighbor's daughter, when I lived in Maryland, came home crying one day because she was told by the kids at school, because his parents told him that she'd been left in the oven too long. And she was devastated, just crushed. So we are going, as we go through these fireside chats, we are going to have one, and I don't know the month, but we're focusing on children, women, how darker skinned people experience colorism, as well as men. Are there any other questions? Yes, Professor Long.
I just wanted to add something to what had been said before for Angela's nephew. I think it's also important to kind of encourage them to find their group, their tribe, so to speak, because being Black is not a monolith. And so you can find community in a variety of areas that will reinforce the idea that you don't have to be a particular way in order to, quote unquote, you know, fit in. And so I think, you know, encouraging your nephew to pursue his passions, knowing that within those spaces you can find community, and that can connect you to ultimately who you are.
Exactly.
Thank
And
you.
Professor Long, do you want to share any more about your research into people experiencing colorism with light skin?
I think I could probably go on and on with the things that I have been told by women off record, on the record, and all of their various experiences. I think what I just want people to walk away with knowing is that there's a lot of trauma associated with being of a lighter complexion that people don't see. And one of the things that I've been told before is the worst is screaming and no one hears you, you know, because of this assumed privilege. And the idea that you don't talk about these things in mixed company, that was something that a respondent said to me, and how it was cathartic to be able to be in a space where for once they could voice like, yeah, this is what has happened and this is what has been done, without feeling like they were being shut down or told that they couldn't experience these things. And so I would just, you know, knowing that and knowing what these women that I have spoken to personally have gone through, just walking away knowing that, you know, wounds, both visible and invisible, exist on lighter skinned individuals in society, and to be cognizant and aware of that.
Thank you. Dr. Hall, what would you like for everyone to take away from this fireside chat relative to light-skinned individuals experiencing colorism?
Well, I hope this has served to open up dialogue, acknowledging the experience of light-skinned African Americans and persons of color. And I also would want to leave to suggest that if possible, I think you can access it online. Light Girls, that was a documentary done by Oprah. I think that was excellent, an excellent piece on describing the experience that light-skinned African Americans experience and other people of color as well.
And do you think, Dr. Hall, that we need to expand the research?
Oh,
And
definitely. Definitely. I mean, when I started, this was considered exotic. And I am delighted to see more people getting involved and studying this issue. It's one thing to talk about it, debate about it, discuss it, but when you have empirical evidence substantiating something, it's difficult to challenge it. And that's what we need, more empirical evidence. There's been enough cases that are taking place. And also remember that this is not something exclusive to the African American community. In fact, I've been quoted as the witness for the first case in the country, and that's just not true. The first case that I came across of colorism was 10 years before the one that I testified for, and that was Felix versus Manquez. It was Puerto Ricans. And in my work in Puerto Rico, I've pulled cases of colorism going back to the 30s. So it's something that affects all of us. It's not exclusive to African Americans.
that's right. And I think that's important to note. Dr. Mishra, what would you like attendees to leave this session with?
First of all, I must congratulate you for envisaging this and talking about this. I feel this remains as one of the initial steps in the right direction, where we bring in more systematic change, inclusion of colorism in not just curricula, but also in policy change, as I see it. This also becomes one of the platforms where people communicate and exchange their traumas, exchange their experiences, and probably learn from each other and build a community. So I feel these will be my thoughts, that I really hope this goes beyond this fireside chat and everybody becomes like a crusader working for against colorism. I'm so sorry, against colorism, and take it to their respective spaces. It can be a private space or a public space or a policy change space.
Very good. I agree with all of your comments, and I want to first thank everyone for attending. And I have to especially thank my students. A lot of my students from my diversity class are here tonight, so thank all of you for attending. I've noted you for noted it down. And my final question is, if nobody else has a question, is that where do we go from here? And I would like to ask each of you, Professor Long, Dr. Hall, Dr. Mishra, where do we go from here with regard to addressing the seriousness of the impact of colorism on light-skinned individuals in society? I will start with you, Professor Long.
I think we continue the work that has already started. So it's something that you bring into your classroom. It's something that I bring into my classrooms. And I think that is the beginning of it, to be able to have these conversations that are not just in quote unquote an academic space as well. And so being able to take it beyond that point, I think that this sort of forum that can welcome in individuals from various backgrounds is the start of that, and bringing attention to the fact that, yes, those who are quote unquote, less melanated can experience this, and that it does have very real effects, impact on them. So I think this is the way that it starts, and I commend you for having those difficult discussions in your class. And I just want to note, like Dr. Hall, the Light Girls documentary, that was the first time. I was a teenager when I watched it, and that was the first time I ever felt seen, like watching that documentary and having someone speak truth to my lived experience, because it wasn't something that people talked about.
No.
And so thank you for even being willing to like be a part of that, because that has greatly impacted me in what I'm doing today.
Yes.
Well, if it produced people like Miss Long, then I think it was a worthwhile effort. I'd also like to thank Dr. Colrith for spearheading a lot of this work. She works, sometimes I wonder if you run on batteries. I told you that, but I think we're doing what needs to be done. Just continue on and be committed. We want to change the entire discourse from race to color.
That's right. Very good. Dr. Mishra?
I want this issue to be acknowledged from where I belong. It remains an unacknowledged issue, as I was telling you. Even our constitution doesn't provide for a law which provides for a non-discrimination clause on the basis of color. At the same time, ironically, we advertise for fair brides, fair groom. There are women who are burnt alive because they're too dark to be accepted in the homes. Even in the marital homes, the husbands would not accept those wives. So when you have this kind of grave colorism practice, then on the other hand, if you don't get acknowledged, that is a problem. So for me, I think acknowledgement of that remains one point that I must always advocate on. Secondly, I feel that this is not just that it is unacknowledged in my country, because even my experience has been when I started working in that, and I think it was almost a decade back, I told Dr. Hall that when I took this issue, that I'm researching on this issue, they're telling there's so many problems in our country. There are caste issue, and you don't even look dark. What are you talking about? This is not even a problem. So where there is a country which has so many issues of caste, gender, so that acknowledgement, because people suffer from it every day, groups suffer from it every day. There is very long lasting impacts on personal lives. So therefore, this issue needs to be acknowledged and then incorporated within the academia, within the curriculum, within the policy and framework. But it also, I must say it at the risk of maybe ridicule, but I have gone through immigration while attending some colorism conferences, and I have been asked by United States immigration officer if I tell them that I'm here for colorism conference. And this has happened to me in Abu Dhabi, this has happened to me in United States. And I'm quoting the immigration officers, they've said, colorism, what the hell is that? So I do not know if there is this constant ignorance still, why people don't know what colorism is, or if they know, but there is still this need of rejecting this, that we don't know what you're talking about. So I feel this can be a very pivotal point. Thank you so much for inviting me to be involved in this discussion.
You're welcome. And I just want to say also that I went through this when we have to hand in our professional development reports and plans. And a colleague wrote back to me and said, what is colorism? It would really be nice if you took the time to explain it and share it. I'm like, no, why don't you pick up a book and read it? No, it's not my job. That's a whole nother story. But the point is that you're right, Dr. Mishra, there is, I don't know if it's intentional or willful ignorance. Or is it that people just don't know that colorism is real? And to Dr. Hall, to your point, and I think a book on how people with light skin are impacted by colorism is something that we need to see. We need to be able to read, because once you are a distinguished scholar of colorism, your research, your work, if the book comes from you, and everybody here will probably agree with me, if that book comes from you talking about light-skinned individuals experiencing colorism, then it's going to be accepted and people will realize it more. Professor Long and Dr. Mishra, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we need to see that book, because I think that's going to make, that is the change that we need to see, to open up eyes, to educate the society that yes, light-skinned people do experience this. And here's the proof. So Dr. Hall, I will push you and nag you and get on your nerves about getting that book out there. But I thank you all for attending. Are there any more questions for Dr. Hall, Dr. Mishra, or Professor Long? Hold on, everybody. Let's see a question. Nikki, everyone here also, if you don't mind, I would like to send you emails about other colorism fireside chats about the conference and other opportunities. I would, if I send you the email and you don't want to be bothered, just say, please remove my name from the list. But I thank all of you for attending. Professor Long, Dr. Hall, Dr. Mishra, I thank all of you for your expertise, your time, and sharing with everyone tonight. This has been wonderful. So if you hold on, Dr. Mishra, Dr. Hall, and Professor Long, I will put you in the backstage room with me. Thank you, everyone. Remember, a survey is going to pop up on the screen once the webinar ends. And I would ask if you please complete it. If you don't get a chance to complete it, it's anonymous, so I won't know who you are. If you miss it, I can send a link out to everyone as well, but just wanted to collect that, your thoughts on the event tonight. Thank you all, thank you everyone for attending, and have a wonderful weekend. Okay, Dr. Hall, I'm going to put you back into the backstage area. Professor Long, I'm moving you to backstage. Dr. Mishra, I'm moving you to backstage. Okay, Dr. Hall, you're going into backstage and I'll be there in a minute. Thank you, everyone. As soon as I close this out, you will automatically see the survey pop up on the screen. Thank you for attending. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Have a good evening, everyone.